So, welcome everyone, and welcome back for those who were here last week. So, as you know, this is a series of talks on evidence and beliefs in the age of mass information. Just a quick announcement: there's going to be a change in the series. So the last speaker could not make it, unfortunately. So she has things happening that make it impossible for her to be here. But we have a replacement, a very good replacement. So Wayne Mirvold here in the room is going to be giving the talk on. So I'll try to remember. So it's internet. No, sorry. Can you?
I think it's information and disinformation in the internet age. I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it sounds.
Check the website if you want to know the real title.
Yeah. But this week we have Maya Goldenberg from the University of Guelph. So Maya works in philosophy of medicine. She's especially interested in evidence-based medicine and all the questions that have to do with knowledge translation, from the research to the practice to the policies. She's done work on vaccine hesitancy, work on diversity among community of knowers, and part of her work is also touched on the notion of expertise. And tonight she's going to answer that question: is there a depth of expertise? So join me in welcoming Maya.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Here to speak about the death of expertise. This question, is expertise dead, fits into widespread, broad concerns. I think the same concerns that motivated the speaker series on evidence and belief in the age of mass information. This questions about how are people going to know things, how are we going to agree on anything with this, a rampant availability of information and disinformation. The death of expertise is one version of that question. So I'll define it. So death of expertise, the short definition of that is that nobody listens to experts anymore. That is the concern, that nobody listens to experts anymore. And what results from that is it allows for misinformation to spread. Bad political choices will presumably be made, and the result will be social divisiveness. And we see evidence of this all around us. There's so much talk about it. We've now got this new vocabulary: post-truth, fake news. Old words like anti-intellectualism, populism are now becoming the most searched words on online dictionaries. But so I want to add the death of expertise to this vocabulary. So this term, the death of expertise, it was coined by the political scientist Tom Nichols in an essay that he wrote in 2014 for a politics and culture magazine called The Federalist. In it, this essay read kind of like a funeral dirge to scientific experts. At issue, at least for Nichols, was this phenomena of people who research things on the internet and then think they know as much as experts do. So when patients contradict or challenge their doctors on vaccination for their children, expertise is dead, that kind of thing. This essay by Nichols was very well received. It seemed to capture what a lot of people were thinking, and it was expanded by Nichols into a book, also called The Death of Expertise, came out in 2017, published by Oxford University Press. This is how Nichols defined the death of expertise. Quoting from his 2014 article, "I wonder if we are witnessing the death of expertise, a Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based, blog-sodden collapse of any division between students and teachers, knowers and wonderers, or even between those of any achievement in an area and those with none at all." So the key ideas that come out of this is the concern, the death of expertise speaks to a leveling of expertise. So we've got on the one hand the downgrading of our traditional experts, the people with PhDs, with letters behind their names are coming down, and the upgrading of non-experts. And of course the internet has a whole lot to do with this. That is the death of expertise. If you look at political science literature, in political science there's a more academic term for what Nichols is describing as the death of expertise, and it is epistemic populism. So whereas populism is usually the challenge to elites for their political power, epistemic populism is a challenge against knowledge elites or experts. It's a preference for folk wisdom or the knowledge of common people, people who gain knowledge by their everyday experience. You might remember in the early days of Donald Trump's presidency, he was consulting the white nationalist Steve Bannon, who spoke of the working man's truths. That's what we mean by epistemic populism. Of course, Nichols is taking this a step further. He's saying it's not just that there's a populist war on experts, but the death of expertise means that the populist war on knowledge experts has been won. And the consequences are great. What's at stake here is our democratic futures. The sort of traditional thinking about democratic governance is, of course, rule by majority. The majority rules on matters of political import. But science and scientific facts has always played an important part in democratic government. Scientific facts are supposed to be the common ground that direct good political action, informed political action. Once we lose scientific facts as a common ground, then that's when we start talking about a post-truth era and the worry that our systems of government are going to collapse. Death of expertise is also supposed to explain public resistance to scientific claims and resistance towards scientific expertise. Things like public challenges to vaccines, whether global warming is real, the status of GMOs. The death of expertise is supposed to explain all of that. And of course, the stakes are high. The stakes are high with the death of expertise, looking out at our future, which might include disease outbreaks, climate catastrophe, the collapse of social democratic order. Defenders of truth and science see war. And that is how public controversies over scientific claims tend to be characterized, always in combative language, in the language of war. You see science, the combatants are science versus nonsense, reason versus ignorance, expertise versus non-expertise. And we hear that science, rationality, and expertise, the rightful vanguards of public health and well-being, are losing this war. And why are they losing? Well, it's because of the publics. The publics are the backbone of liberal democratic society, and they are spending too much time on the internet, and they are allegedly failing at their civic duties to be properly informed participants in democratic governance. There is a lot of commentary. What I'm saying should probably sound familiar to you, because anyone that opens up a magazine or a science magazine is going to have heard some version of this. There's so much discussion about why public controversies exist. Why do people reject scientific claims? There are some key themes that emerge in explaining why this happens. One is rampant scientific illiteracy among the general public. This is the book cover of just one take on that. Chris Mooney is an American science journalist. Cheryl Kirschenbaum, the co-author, is a science educator. That results in this kind of anti-intellectualism, this populist anti-intellectualism being embraced that I spoke of, and the result of that is the end of expertise, or the death of expertise. This is the common thinking about this problem of downgraded expertise. So I have read widely on this, because I just finished a book manuscript on framing public resistance to scientific claims, hopefully coming out next year. And so I read broadly in the sort of in media, in popular science books, in academic literature, trying to understand the characterizations of why it is that public resists scientific claims. And what I found running through it was this language of war. And I called this the war on science and expertise. That's how public resistance to science has been widely framed. You definitely find it in the American popular literature. American journalists love a good war metaphor, and American science journalists love the war on science as a phrase. This is a 2015 cover of National Geographic, The War on Science. and you can't read the small print, but it's all about the kind of pseudoscientific claims that circulate around the lunar landing, who shot JFK, vaccines, climate change, that kind of thing. In 2016, the American writer and filmmaker Sean Otto wrote the book, The War on Science, and it came out just a year before Nichols' book, The Death of Expertise, did. And I've read them both, and they are pretty much the same book. They are saying the same thing, okay? There's a war out there, a war on science, a war on experts. We'd better do something quick. Now, in my own work, I've come up with a different framework for understanding it, and I call this the crisis of trust. While I agree that there is a downgrading of expertise, we shouldn't challenge that claim. That's sort of well documented in all kinds of national and international surveys. Trust in intellectuals, trust in experts and expert institutions is very low. What I don't see it as some kind of war on science. I instead see it as a crisis of trust. So against the claim that expertise is dead, I would say that we are suffering from low public trust in scientific experts and expert claims. And that leads me to different conclusions. So I actually do want to make some kind of some comparisons between the two frameworks. So what I want to do here is do some comparisons between the death of expertise explanation for why experts have been, for this account of the death of expertise as an account of downgraded expertise versus what I call the crisis of public trust in experts. And I'm going to parse the two by covering these four themes. First, the two frameworks hold two very different accounts of the role of science in democratic decision-making. And because of that different accounting of how science works in relations to the public, you get different answers to how we should address the problem of public resistance, that's number two, and also who is responsible for the problem. And finally, the question, is expertise dead? Is expertise dead? We land in different, on different answers. The death of expertise framework, I guess you can tell, are going to say yes to this question. And I don't want to spoil it, but I'm going to say no. I don't think expertise is dead. I think expertise has been recalibrated, but I'll get into why I think that. Okay, so starting with number one, the role of science in democratic decision-making. The first framework, the death of expertise, subscribes to a vision of how science operates in democratic decision-making that looks something like something like this image. It subscribes to this account where there's this thing called science. It transcends partisan politics. It steers rational political decision-making. So participatory politics, rules by majority, can go in all kinds of directions. There's always the potential that it goes off the rails, and that's why we need science. Science is that rightful anchor to keep political decision-making on the right course, to steer it on the right course. And that's why we have levels of bureaucracy within democratic governance of scientific advisors, consulting politicians, consulting the publics, telling us the facts that we need to know in order to work out our policies from there. So the death of expertise, or the war on science, is threatening insofar that as it untethers politics from its rational basis. The result of that is social chaos, economic instability, rule by the powerful. It pretty much couldn't get much worse. And that's why the war on science is seen as so necessary. Nichols, and part of this death of expertise framework, strongly subscribes to this view of science as that rational anchor. He writes this: a fair number of Americans now seem to reject the notion that one person is more likely to be right about something due to education, experience, or other attributes of achievement than any other. So that's that sort of leveling issue that we've already noticed. He goes on with now in his book, he continues from there with a fair bit of public blaming and shaming. Americans have reached a point where ignorance, especially of anything related to public policy, is an actual virtue. This book did not receive great reviews. deservedly, I think, but all of the reviewers, and it did get a lot of reviews, New York Times and everything, it got a lot of reviews where the reviewers were consistently very sympathetic to the premise that motivated this book, this idea that the public thinks they know better than experts. That was widely seen as gotta be right, unquestioned. Reviewers would say, yes, of course, Dunning-Kruger effect, we've seen this before. Now, in my own work on vaccine hesitancy, I've done a lot of work on parents who hesitate about vaccines and refuse vaccines. There's a ton of social science literature available to anyone interested on this topic. There's surveys, there's interviews, there's media analysis of internet chat groups involving worried parents. And from what I can see, the publics do not think they know better. Instead, they aren't buying what the experts are selling. And that's quite different. This theme of anti-intellectualism and death of expertise was already very present in popular science writing. I look back at the sort of best-selling books from the last 15 years, and I found a lot of writing on the relationships between science and publics, and science and politics. And because it's focused on science denialism was what came out as a strong tendency, and it's something that needed a lot of look. And as you can see, science denialism is not seen as a small issue. It is seen as an existential threat. You can see that in the subtitles to just 3 books. How the anti-vaccines threaten us all, how irrational thinking harms the planet and threatens our lives, how science deniers threaten our future. So the threat is great. And with that threat, of course, is a call for war. So first of all, public resistance to scientific claims is uncritically taken to be science denialism. So for all the reasons that people might resist, it must be science denialism. That's sort of taken as given. And because of that, we need war. We need to vanquish the enemy threat. In these books, denialism is characterized as something like a contagion. It spreads through internet, of course. And that kind of framing of the issue enforces this kind of us-them thinking. On the one side, there are the experts, the vigilant defenders of truth, and then there are the publics who are informed to the point of dangerous. I also looked at the academic work on this issue too, and there is, thankfully, a Sociology of Expertise, which is well positioned to look at these very issues around the downgrading of expertise. And sure enough, 2 members of this community, sociologists Harry Collins and Robert Evans, took up this concern about the downgrading of expertise. They wrote a paper in 2002 initiating a new area of science studies, the studies of expertise and experience. And in that paper, they said, this is the thing we need to talk about. We need to talk about why experts are not admired like they used to be. Did we perhaps create this problem with all of our social constructivism? And how do we reclaim expertise? So from that work, they eventually wrote a book called Rethinking Expertise, came out in 2008, where they do just that. They try to reclaim expertise from its current downgraded position. And they also want to think about what is special about expert knowledge. So in that book, they decipher what makes experts unique and worth listening to. So their work in this book can actually, I'm not going to go through all of this, can actually be summarized in this handy graphic that they made. This is from their book. It's called the Periodic Table of Expertises. That's not a typo. It is the expertises. And this summarizes the work that they did. They want, as I mentioned, they want to decipher what is unique and worthy about expertise and help us kind of figure out what to do about it. So in this table, you get an account of different types of expertise and also different sources of expertise. So you learn about the different kinds of expertise that people can have, where those expertise come from. Some come from our lives, some come from our study, and importantly, what claims each type of expert can make, that they're justified to make. So Collins and Evans are working with this idea that there is confusion about expertise, and that is what's resulting in this leveling of expertise where everyone thinks they're an expert. They also think that if we clarify or disentangle the kinds of expertise, this will set us all on the right path of recognizing and appreciating when that expert is warranted to pronounce on things. I'll give you an example, an application from the book. They talk about anti-vaccine mommy bloggers who often claim that they are experts on their own children. That's a common thing that is said. And to this, Collins and Evans can respond, yes, you are experts on your children. Your lived experience parenting this child makes you an expert on your children. However, that does not make you an expert on vaccines. To be an expert on vaccines, you actually have to be immersed in a community of vaccine scientists. So there, we've figured out anti-vaccine mommy bloggers. Collins and Evans, throughout this book, seem to be at pains to make clear that just because you're an expert at some things, that does not make you an expert on everything. That is their diagnosis of the death of expertise, that we've somehow misunderstood that. Just because you're an expert on some things doesn't make you an expert on everything. Collins came up with a different phrasing of that leveling phenomena, of this downgrading of expertise. It was default expertise. It came out in a book that he wrote in 2014. This was a more popular science and publicly accessible book. It kind of summarized the lengthier book that he'd written with Collins and Evans. So he coined this phrase, default expertise. It is the idea that everybody's got a point. And because everybody's got a point, that means that either everyone is an expert or no one is an expert. There's a leveling going on there. Default expertise is supposed to describe the sense of empowerment, that sense that every citizen is part of the game of science and technology. Default expertise is also meant to explain the apparent reasonableness of telling worried parents to do the research and decide for yourself about vaccines, and the energy with which some parents actually do it and come up with conclusions that they feel very, very confident about. Collins and Evans have a response to these armchair vaccine experts, or these parent researchers, and it has to do with this. Okay, so I'm just going to point here the different kind of expertise that people can have. If you study up on vaccines on the internet, you can actually gain certain amounts of expertise. You might have a sort of trivia level. You could win a trivia game on experts. See, they call that beer mat knowledge. Collins is British, so he calls it a beer mat instead of a coaster. If you read some blogs and popular science books on vaccines, you might have something like popular understanding of vaccines. The most educated parent researcher might be the ones that download the academic papers, the scientific papers, and read them on vaccines. They would have primary source knowledge. And even though they think that the primary source knowledge experts are the one most prone to thinking that they are now experts on vaccines, but they are not. In order to have the specialist knowledge that you need to pronounce on vaccines, you have to go over here. You have to have interactional expertise. That is the kind of specialist knowledge that comes from being part of the specialist community. Getting a feeling, not just reading the literature, but getting a feeling for what the community thinks. Collins points out that you cannot get a good picture of what is going on in science just from reading the literature. For example, you can't tell whether a paper is being taken seriously by that community of knowers. So for that reason, the parent researcher is not an expert on vaccines and cannot pronounce on it. Now, in this argument for the special nature of interactional expertise, Collins is acknowledging that knowledge arises in community. Knowledge arises in community. And this idea that knowledge is social, that science is social, is key to an area of philosophy that I work in called social epistemology. So where epistemology is the area of philosophy that studies knowledge and justified belief, what makes a belief justified is knowledge. Social epistemology construes human knowledge as a collective achievement, and one that is largely shaped by social relationships and institutions. So science is seen as a community exercise. So science has been thought of in this way as a social process, most notably by the philosopher Helen Longino, who wrote Science and Social Knowledge, looking at that. Okay, so back to Collins and this idea that specialist knowledge arises in community. I think his acknowledgement of the social nature of science knowledge is right, but it doesn't go far enough. A key feature of any communal practice are its relationships between individuals or individual to institutions, sometimes one group to another. And all relationships, any relationship, has a trust component. Relationships are built on trust. So attending to how trust figures into this social exercise of knowledge building that we call science is instructive. And that gets me to my preferred framework. Okay. So now I'm turning to this crisis of public trust in experts. As I mentioned, I want to address it answering these 4 questions, looking at how science is understood to operate in democratic decision making, and that gives different answers to how do we address the problem of public resistance, who's responsible for this problem, and of course the question of whether expertise is dead. So as part of this crisis of trust, I want to argue that poor public trust in poor public trust is a problem for science. So I've already mentioned that poor public trust in scientific institutions is well established. We've got all this survey research going back decades and decades showing that public attitudes towards science, experts and its institutions have been going down, down, down. Every year, Pew Research puts out these things saying, well, it couldn't get much lower, and then the next year, it is lower. Poor public trust is a problem for science. I think that is an underappreciated phenomena, an underappreciated finding, let's say. I'm going to show you that trust is woven into all aspects of science. Trust is endemic to the creation of scientific knowledge. Trust is needed to manage dissent and disagreement. It's needed for consensus building and legitimating consent, things like ratifying consensus statements. And those are just things that happen within the scientific community. Trust is most evident when we talk about how science is taken up by the public. So there, the need for trust is very noticeable. I characterize public resistance to science and experts as a symptom of poor public trust, and I also think of it as a problem of scientific governance rather than a problem with the publics. Okay, but so to get into that, I first want to define what I mean by trust. Trust is a heavily theorized concept in ethics, in philosophy of science, in sociology and social theory, and there's general convergence on this sort of basic definition. To trust is to have confidence in someone or something. In the context of science, we'll be talking about having trust in knowledge producers or trust in knowers. Will I have the confidence to trust your expert advice on something and follow through on it? Trust is an inescapable feature of relationships with others. It's that point where contracts end. You can try to contract your relationship as much as you want. You are allowed to do this, you have to do this. When I do this, you have to do this. But eventually you're going to get to those moments in relationship to others that are not covered by the contract. That's when you need trust. Trust is that feeling, that confidence that the person you are in relationship with will do the right thing. Trust is characterized by relationships of dependency. The person who is trusting is put in a vulnerable position. They are unequal to the expert in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their vulnerability to being harmed. The risk of broken trust is so great or always present that sociologists have described trusting others as taking a leap of faith. In the context of an information gap, things I need to know about whether you're actually going to treat me justly, you need to do this necessary bridging of an information gap. And we do this in situations of risk or situations of uncertainty. What you need to do, you fill this gap by a certain suspension of uncertainties. Now, how confidently will the non-expert leap? That's going to depend on the non-expert's perception of the experts. Your trust in the expert is going to depend on your perception of the expert as knowledgeable. Do they know their stuff, that they can actually give me good advice? And some kind of perception of their moral character. Do I trust that they are going to report honestly and have my interests at heart? So there's this expectation of goodwill, or at least moral integrity on the part of an expert. If you don't have that, you're not going to trust them. Or if you don't have the perception of that, you're probably not going to take that leap. There's qualitative research into parents making vaccine decisions that capture or highlight multiple leaps of faith that are taken in the face of incomplete knowledge and in the face of anxiety over future unknowns. So these parents take these trusting leaps or deny them in relation to people that they know. It's in relation, you take advice from your peers, from your family members, from health professionals. You might even include some ideas about the institutions that these health professionals represent. You need to perceive them as trustworthy and working in the interests of the public. So this tells us that trust is a means of social cohesion. In other words, it's a means of connecting with others through emotional ties, what in moral psychology they call affective commitments. So what's important for our discussion about public resistance to science and the death of expertise is that it is not the growing mountain of data that are convincing parents to vaccinate their kids, but a leap in favor of the scientific consensus. You trust the consensus, you take that leap. Vaccine hesitators and refusers would situate themselves in different spheres of familiarity, social groups that disqualify the scientific consensus on vaccines. There's actually a symmetry in that decision making. It's commonly parsed as vaccine acceptors understand the science and therefore they follow expert advice on vaccines. Anti-vaxxers or vaccine refusers don't understand the science and therefore they don't follow. Instead, what comes out in the literature is something more like calculations that are made by vaccine acceptors or refusers that reinforce the social groups that they already belong to. So trust certainly has cognitive components. It's not that you're unaware of the research into, let's say, vaccine safety and efficacy, but there's also emotional and purposeful components into the trusting relationships, the leaps of faith that we make. Okay, so that's trust, but what does trust have to do with science, which is arguably the most skeptical and least trusting of any knowledge-producing enterprise? Well, thinking about science as a social enterprise, which I've already encouraged you to do, should give you the sense that trust is not missing from science. So this image here is a good representation of what science looks like. Science is usually done, this is just your typical laboratory setting, it's done in groups. We usually have a team working in a lab together, they learn from each other, they contribute to projects, each putting in a little bit to help solve some broader problem. You might work with other researchers in different communities, and you'll see scientific papers with dozens of authors on it, co-authors on it, sometimes hundreds, even thousands of co-authors, all bringing in their bit to create this thing that we call scientific knowledge. Sociologists have entered the lab and sort of taken a close look at how scientific information is constructed. And what you'll see is it is not the case, against the epistemic ideals, that you trust no one or that you study for yourself. This is our Enlightenment scientists. See, science doesn't really look like that anymore. It is not the case that you trust no one and you are skeptical about everything. Instead, you trust your collaborators a lot. No one has the expertise and the time to oversee every single bit of a large, complex project that's being done. Instead, you need to take on trust that your collaborators are doing their bit of the work well, reporting honestly, and contributing effectively to the project. So through and through, rather than epistemic, this is the terminology, rather than studying for yourself and trusting no one, there is a lot of dependency and trust within the framing of science and the making of scientific knowledge. So because of that, trust plays a large part in establishing scientific knowledge, in legitimating that knowledge as true and universal. By universal, I mean true for everyone. So that's trust within a scientific community. If you exit the scientific community and look at how the publics in science interact with each other, the case for epistemic dependency and trust should be easier to see. Non-experts, everyday people, rely on scientific advice all the time. What things I should buy, what food will make me healthy, whether I should bring an umbrella when I leave the house. I'm looking to experts for advice. This is a strike against the death of expertise, because when I look around, I see experts everywhere. When there is a good relationship between experts and non-experts, you can have a smooth transfer of knowledge where the experts provide sound scientific advice, the non-experts take "thank you very much," and they take it and incorporate it into their lives. And that's a good relationship. Non-experts benefit from good insight from experts. And that's because experts know more than non-experts do. But of course, we know already that epistemic dependency is risky. There is the chance that we will be misled by experts. The fact that we have public controversy right now over scientific claims, vaccines, climate change, that kind of thing, tells us that the relationships between experts and non-experts are strained. And of course, that's a problem for everyone, including non-experts, who lose the benefits of good expert advice when they say, don't take good advice from experts because they think there's something going on here. So the challenge for non-experts is well-placed trust. We want to trust experts that are providing us with good information, but we don't always know if our trust is well-placed. Non-experts usually cannot assess the scientific claims that are made, whether the technical issues around whether I should vaccinate, whether climate modeling is accurate. That's because as a non-expert, you don't have the technical expertise to assess those claims. In fact, if I did have it, I wouldn't be asking for expert advice. But experts can do something, and they do this all the time. They tend to assess the expert's character. They can use a different kind, it's what Collins and Evans called meta-expertise, but we didn't get into that. They can use their kind of intuitive sense about whether this expert seems honest, whether they seem competent in their field of expertise. Are they conscientious about their work? And if I answer yes to these things, I will probably take that leap, and I will trust the expert advice. So what follows from that is that the rationality of following expert advice, it makes sense to follow expert advice if I perceive if the expert is trustworthy and if they've got credibility too. By credibility, I mean a perception of trustworthiness. So experts need to be trustworthy, but they also need to be perceived as trustworthy by the publics. So that's all to say that relations of trust mediate successful exchanges between scientific institutions and the public. Okay? Now, just because good trust relationships exist, it doesn't mean that disagreement won't come up. And we know this from looking at even healthy scientific communities tend to have dissent and disagreement among them. And that's actually seen as a good thing. It's good for science when people disagree. It makes criticisms are good. It makes the final result, the science, more robust. So the sort of science is at least the ideal of science is seen as something that's largely democratic. We're public with our information and we're accountable to criticism. That's kind of the ideal of how scientific communities operate. Philosophers of science, people who think about how do we make science even better than it is now, are so enamored by this model of dissent and criticism that they have come up with all kinds of interesting ways to make our criticism even better. Things like diversifying the scientific community, bring in people with different backgrounds, with different life experiences, and you might get more rigorous criticism, and you might end up with better science. Unfortunately, dissent is so important that it's been co-opted by corporate interests. I know some of you were at Naomi Oreskes' talk today, and that is that she's done great work sort of exposing how, say, oil and gas industry has funded climate research to raise doubt about the validity of climate science and whether global warming exists. So we've actually had to create rules for reasonable dissent that is actually trying to further knowledge rather than be obstructionist and to lead to political gain. So you've got these rules in place, and that sort of gives us a framework of communicative practices that can lead to consensus. We are public and accountable to dissent, and you can come to some kind of robust consensus after the dissent has been considered and responded to. It doesn't mean that all disagreement will disappear. It just means that we can come up with some agreement, acknowledge that there is some disagreement, and the entire enterprise doesn't need to collapse because of that. Okay, that is a picture of science and when it works well. Now compare that to public controversies over science, and you've got something entirely different. Public dissent and disagreement regarding scientific claims, it's a bit of the Wild West out there. It is rough and lawless. We don't seem to have any shared rules, communicative practices, or frames of reference for managing disagreement on the public stage. What counts as admissible evidence is contested. What arguments are legitimate, also contested. Who are the credible experts? Which one is legitimate science? Which one is junk science? Not just that, this is when people talk about post-truth. When you start talking about this, people get so, they say, oh, you know, we're post-truth. We've got nothing to work with anymore. Not just that, as if that wasn't enough, scientific arguments are often placeholders for deeper disagreements over values that do not get proper airing on the public stage. So when you see technical debates over scientific issues playing out in the public sphere, things like different readings of atmospheric temperatures, and you might ask yourself, or I ask myself when I see that on like climate skeptic blogs, and think, why are people, members of the public, so invested in these academic debates? Like, why does your average person care about, you know, the intricacies of climate modeling or these kind of academic debates? And it's because, there is an answer to that, it's because they are worried about the downstream effect of that. They wonder what is going to follow from this science being accepted as true. What policies will be put in place? How will that affect my life, my sense of well-being, my family, my job, that kind of thing. So that's why scientific arguments get amplified to this extent, and partly because we don't get to talk about our values in a very constructive way. It's also the case that scientific consensus does not settle debates. And that is surprising to many. Scientific consensus gets sort of positioned as one side of a debate in the public stage. And that's, of course, not what the scientific consensus is supposed to be. It's supposed to settle debate, not just offer one side of the debate. When I look at how the consensus is supposed to do this, so I guess I'm trying to say that there are some people who are very shocked that the consensus doesn't settle debates. And I look at papers like this. So this is a paper I came across recently called Consensus on Consensus. It's written by a bunch of researchers who have done work on climate consensus and tried to sort of parse out what is it about the consensus that the publics don't understand. As you see, Naomi Oreskes is one of the authors. So they wrote this paper in 2016, John Cook and colleagues. The consensus that humans are causing recent global warming is shared by 90 to 100% of publishing climate scientists, according to 7 independent studies by co-authors of this paper. So they go on to detail. They do analysis of these seven climate science papers, sort of looking at the consensus, and they find, yes, indeed, the consensus on the consensus is that it's 97% of scientists agree. So when I read this, I kind of thought, okay, there seems to be some assumption here that perhaps the publics don't understand the consensus. Perhaps that's what's holding the public back from agreeing that global warming is a thing and that we need to act on that. So we make a consensus on a consensus, and I saw a blog post written by John Cook, the first author, and he seemed to be saying, like, okay, guys, we're done here. We don't need to talk about the consensus anymore. The consensus on the consensus shows us global warming is a thing, so let's act on that, right? So I think this is the assumption here, that the publics just don't understand the consensus. And I wonder if 5 years from now, they're going to publish the consensus on the consensus on the consensus to show us, like maybe if we just reach that pinnacle of consensus, everything's going to fall into place, because maybe the publics just don't understand. Look, I want to acknowledge that, or appreciate the surprise, appreciate the fact that the scientific consensus does not settle debates, because that's what it's supposed to do. Consensus is, of course, it's the best we've got in terms of truth-seeking measures in science. It is the majority view of our best trained, most knowledgeable experts. It is often written, the climate, the IPCC report, for one, is written with a public audience in mind. It's supposed to educate the public and settle debate. So, of course, it's unnerving when members of the public reject the consensus or call it impartial or biased. Because what they're doing by saying that is they are rejecting a very elaborate set of mechanisms, epistemic, methodological, institutional mechanisms that are meant to ensure reliable knowledge. They're just throwing it away and saying no. And that's really the best we've got. And that's frustrating. So what is the appropriate response? What is the appropriate response when the scientific consensus does not fulfill its function, when people of engendering public trust? Here is what's happening now. In the context of vaccine hesitancy, because this is my area of study, people who raise questions about vaccines will often be ridiculed for doing that. How can you think that? How can you give a weight to a minority dissenting view against that democratic spirit of science that I spoke of earlier? Now we've got science reporters writing articles like, "This is why you have no business challenging scientific experts." And the frustration is palpable here. The people that write these kind of articles are asking, they're incredulous when they ask, why would you trust the comments by a celebrity mom who attributes her knowledge of autism to the University of Google over the knowledge of many, many expert scientists? I think the assumption here is that maybe the publics just don't understand expertise. That's certainly what Collins and Evans thought. Of course, there are mechanisms for making a consensus trustworthy. So when a consensus is rigorous, it follows these kinds of steps. There is representation by top experts. There is proper uptake of reasonable dissent, not spurious dissent. There is an impartial review of the best research evidence, and that's done very carefully. There, of course, is honest reporting of the findings, and the conflicts of interest by its participants are properly managed. Now, these mechanisms are mostly shielded from public view because they're done internal to the community. They're usually done in closed-door settings or in academic conferences and on the pages of journals that are not largely accessible to the public. So there's that final step in the expert-lay exchange where, if all goes well, the publics will accept the expert consensus and make that leap of faith. And make that leap of faith because they believe that experts have done their due diligence, have properly gone through these mechanisms and done it well. But of course, in this position of trust, the outsiders are once again vulnerable, and there's no sympathy for that. The publics are implored to trust science, trust in a process that does not permit non-expert contributions and is largely closed door. In the case of vaccines, there's even threats of sanctions for not following expert directives. Even with all that, the publics are instructed to trust, and some are not willing to do so. So I'm anticipating an objection. Some people will say, you don't need to trust the consensus, you just follow the numbers. Okay, don't trust the consensus, just follow the numbers. Some people will say, consensus statements, it's a numbers game. If you follow the majority, you're more likely to get the right advice. Just follow the numbers and don't trust anybody. But of course, there's a qualification that you need to accept to this argument about the numbers game, is that we only follow the numbers, follow the majority, if we think they come from multiple and reliable sources. Otherwise, the numbers, the fact that 97 scientists say it, wouldn't mean anything to us. by admitting that, you'll see that trust, again, is ineliminable. Because, again, people standing on the outside don't know how rigorously that kind of consensus was established. In the world of vaccines, vaccine advocates will say, yeah, you can play the number games and you can follow, and therefore you should vaccinate your kids, because I can point you to a wide body of literature coming from many countries, different research teams, all converging on that the same conclusion that vaccines are safe and effective. Vaccine refusers or hesitators might see that weight of evidence differently. They'll say they see nefarious connections between industry, the biotech industry, and vaccine advocates and manufacturers. If it's true that scientists are being just sort of slavishly following the line of industry interests, then we certainly shouldn't be following the numbers. That would be good reason not to follow. So the rationality of following the consensus is still a matter of trust. You need to trust that it was done well. Okay, a pause to acknowledge the difficulty of decision making. It is still the case, despite all of the work that's been done in vaccine outreach, that parents often report that they don't know what to do. They want to do what's best for their kids, and they don't know who to listen to. This was even acknowledged by the American Academy of Advancement of Science. They wrote this paper called Public Trust in Vaccines a few years ago, and they characterized it really well as a welter of voices, the sort of confusion that parents feel. A welter of voices in medicine, government, politics, media, churches, schools, among one's families and friends can confuse well-meaning parents who want to do the best for their offspring. Online forums where appeals to emotion often drown out thoughtful discussion also play a role in vaccine discussions. So this is exactly where the consensus is supposed to come in. You've got a noisy public stage, you've got conflicting opinions. That's where the scientific consensus is supposed to come in and guide parents out of the fray. The scientific consensus is therefore not fulfilling its public function. And with that weakness, in the scientific consensus, that's where expertise proliferates. I made this slide in 1 minute, I swear. It was, off the top of my head, the best known experts in the world of vaccine refusal. I came up with Andrew Wakefield, you all know him. You maybe know Bob Sears. There is the founder of the National Vaccine Information Center. Del Bigtree is the movie producer who produced Andrew Wakefield's film Vaxxed, Robert Kennedy Jr., Jenny McCarthy. I'm here to tell you that there are vaccine skeptical websites that keep and maintain lists of physicians and medical scientists who've spoken out against vaccines. So what I see here are a lot of experts. However, the case for expertise has changed. It used to be the case, and I think Colin still holds to this view, that being an expert meant close proximity to the community of experts, like the vaccine scientists, right? That gave you the interactional expertise. That's what made you an expert. Instead, there's this valorizing, because the consensus is on shaky grounds, there's this valorizing of the outsider, right? Your distance from that community, because the inside community is seen as corrupt. Being an outsider actually makes you more credible in the eyes of at least some people. There's also the interesting status of the insider-outsider, people who are trained in medical science, like Bob Sears and Andrew Wakefield, who have decided to turn their back on the medical consensus on vaccines. They are particularly loved. They're seen as mavericks, as scientific heretics, and they are trusted and loved and seen as the real experts. So this is a good moment for some self-reflection by experts and by expert institutions. I think everyone agrees that the public needs trustworthy science. It is hard to make decisions if we don't have it. But I think less appreciated is that science needs the public's trust too. At minimum, you need it to get the funding that you need to do the research that you want, and to have the public stay out of your business. But if you are working in an area of policy-relevant science, things that affect people's everyday lives, you come under much more scrutiny. Public trust is, of course, indispensable to scientific institutions. And if you are doing policy relevant science, you need all those stakeholders to buy into the work that you're doing, and that includes the public. So public health, for example, cannot achieve its institutional aims if it does not get buy-in from the public. Because of that, the presence of vaccine hesitancy is not a side issue and a problem with the public, it's a problem for public health. And it's time to recognize that these democratically accountable and publicly relevant scientific institutions need to earn and maintain the public's trust. Low institutional trust means that institutions are not doing what they need to do. Their aims are not just to generate the best science, but also to get people to buy into it. And so it's for that reason that I say that this is a problem with scientific governance, not simply something that's wrong with the publics. So now I'm going to just draw some quick conclusions. I've argued that the evidence that most of us have for our beliefs on policy relevant science turns crucially on epistemic trust. We don't do the research for ourselves, we trust in others to give us the information that we want. And because of that, poor public trust in experts and expert sources leads to public resistance to scientific claims. And this rests on a different image of science in relation to the public, one that includes bringing in the publics in order to trust them. And I'm not being a relativist about science here, saying that the science doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But what I am recognizing is that, or asking you to recognize too, is that science operates within a constellation of social forces, including the institutions, the people, and the world that it is operationalized in. Because of that, it's not enough to just have the best science. You have to have the credibility on your side too. For that reason, I think strong trust relations with the public will actually ensure the prominence of science rather than demote it, as the war of science seems to suggest that it does. So for that reason, I'd like to suggest that scientific institutions need to work harder to earn and maintain the public trust, and in terms of communications, worry less about what's wrong with the publics and do looking more at ourselves instead. Okay, thank you very much. Sure, I will take questions. Are there any questions? You were first, yes.
So how has your work informed you about how scientific institutions earn and maintain our trust? So what concrete things can they do to change this mess that we're in now?
Lots of public relations, for sure. There's now interest in public outreach, getting public interested in science. There are efforts that are done actually at the governmental level to get more public participation in science. Things like having community members sit on advisory boards, so getting a little bit of input from the public. And this shouldn't just be tokenism. This should be an effort to ensure the public that science operates in the public interest and not somehow exclusive from it. Most of the recommendations, I've made recommendations about vaccines just because that's my area of research. I've talked about things like managing conflicts of interest within science. It is within biomedical science. It is the case that the publics are not happy with current industry relationships with bioscience. This is true in other areas of science too, but I'll focus on what I know. It is, of course, a large order to say that we need to regulate it more, just because medical science depends so much on that funding. But when you've got rampant vaccine hesitancy and the potential for outbreaks, this is the time that we want to visit those kind of relationships. So pretty much focus on the things that are causing public mistrust and address those. That's a very general comment. All of it needs to be specified to other scientific institutions. Yes.
For the anti-vaxxers in your examples here, you're saying that they will mostly be hesitant, probably due to confusion or lack of expertise, but there's got to be other reasons there, though, underlying the mom who doesn't want the vaccine, and it could be something from her childhood or something innate to them that has nothing to do with science? Because you could throw all the science on and say, yeah, I know, but I'm not vaccinated. So what is the other reason, mentally, physically, whatever, that they're saying no?
Yeah, there's no one fit answer for that. There's many reasons that people hesitate about vaccines, but there is, at least from the empirical research, a lot of uncertainty around the industry influence on vaccination. And because of that, and that's such a compelling narrative to many people, not unreasonably. I mean, we see what happens when industry does corrupt biomedical science. Because of that, it means that you can't get past and have other conversations, like when you say things like, well, I had measles as a child and it wasn't all that bad. Well, the scientific research tells us that when it's bad, it's really bad. And there's all kinds of other compelling reasons to vaccinate your child against vaccines. But when you, industry, worries about industry influence corrupting science creates a stopgap where we can't get past it. So I'm interested in doing that. I also, the kind of recommendations I've made are simple things like stop calling anti-vaxxers stupid, don't shame them in public, give primary care providers more time to speak to patients, because building trusting relationships take time. Instead, physicians are rushed, so they are not unreasonably flustered and irritated when a patient comes in with 25 questions about things they read on the internet, even though if you think about it, there's nothing wrong with asking questions and there should be time to respond to it. Yes. One from that side, and then I'll take you next. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the talk, of course, but I wonder if there's a pair of problems, or a short-term problem and a long-term problem. And you're addressing the long-term problem with this. What about a short-term problem is getting people vaccinated for measles right away? Everything you say is really enticing, but there's a certain sense in which a lot of people are going to die while we're convincing the reluctant public to come on side.
Yeah.
I'm sort of optimistic about force, because I've noticed that a lot of jurisdictions are now saying no more options, you just have to do it. And I think Germany just a day or two ago made the measles vaccine compulsory for everybody, no exceptions, except of course the medical exception. And I wonder if you could comment on the difference and whether you think the short-term solution, force, I'll just use force as a shorthand, okay? Whether that'll make martyrs of people and hurt the long-term program. And maybe there's some related issues there too.
So you're asking about, the question here was about what kind of vaccine policy should be put in place. So there's two ways that you get people to vaccinate. You do it either through persuasion, and the issues around trust and persuasion go together. And you're right, they work slowly, and they won't work on everybody, of course, but they will probably work on a lot of people. The other one is through regulation. In Canada now, children entering schools and daycares need to get vaccinated for a number of a fair number of diseases. Otherwise, if the parents refuse, they sign an exemption form. It can be for a religious exemption, it can be a personal belief exemption, but the point is, if you want out, you can get out. So the work that's been done actually in many countries has been to limit the extent that exemptions are available to people. One way is to get rid of them. California got a lot of attention a couple of years ago they said no more personal belief exemptions and no more religious exemptions. And because of that, if you want to go to school, you have to vaccinate. And if California. The state of California. And that was very bold legislation. Most politicians prefer to waffle on these issues. And I mentioned California because now we've been able to track what's the results of that. The result of that is a lot of children have been pulled out of school and are now being homeschooled. So that's got long-term effects too, not tracked by public health, but it can result in all kinds of other things. Second, those kids are still not vaccinated. The kids that are in school, yes, are more likely to be vaccinated. They have higher rates they track how many kindergartners are vaccinated in California. The numbers are higher, but when you take out the reduced numbers, anyway, it's not much higher. They also saw in California that suddenly there was a spike in the number of medical exemptions that were granted. So medical exemptions are still allowed. If you've got a compromised immune system, you cannot be vaccinated. Nobody questions that. So suddenly there were doctors who were apparently making good money selling medical exemptions, and that was happening too. So now they've had to introduce more legislation, and it just passed earlier this year, saying we are going to have a much firmer grip on when medical exemptions are granted. It used to just be the decision of the doctor. So pretty much we might end up regulating. It will increase the number of vaccinated children, because when the cost is higher than the benefit, well, you know how that works. If it gets too hard to not vaccinate your kids, people that kind of sit on the fence will vaccinate. However, that people that are really firm in their commitment will find other ways, like homeschooling their kids. It has the potential to drive the issue underground, and even make people who might have been okay about vaccines but are not okay about this kind of state imposition to do it. So I think there will be long-term effects that will be harder to track, because it's not a public health issue, that I'm worried about. I actually support making exemptions hard to get. I think there should be non-medical exemptions. I look at what Ontario has done. They keep making it a little harder every single time. Used to be you just had to download a form and get it notarized by your member of parliament. Now you have to go to your doctor, get it signed, but first do an educational class. They've just added these bureaucratic steps to make those people that are sitting on the fence say, fine, I'll just vaccinate my kids. And that actually works and doesn't create the kind of potential downstream problems that I'm worried about. Okay, yes.
What do you think about this kind of like evil spread of disinformation nowadays? You see it on Facebook and from right-wing news and from corrupt politicians. And I mean, I'm not sure the public or certain segments of the public are to be blamed. I mean, it's no wonder people are confused. I mean, they get bombarded with information all the time. Not everyone has like a really hard science background. I mean,
right.
So, what do you think about that?
You can't talk about these kinds of issues without talking about how the internet is spreading misinformation. And maybe you already know that social media is trying to crack down on this. They've introduced all kinds of changes to their search functions, and like Pinterest and Facebook are saying we will not spread misinformation about vaccines and things like that. And that seems like a good idea. But really, it's a technical solution to what isn't a technical problem. The question is, why do people go to the internet to look for vaccine information at all? Why don't they just go straight to the Public Health Agency of Canada, get their information, and stop there? And the reason is there's a sort of wavering trust in these institutions, so they look elsewhere, and then they get misinformed. Everyone knows that there's misinformation on the internet. Here's an opportunity to make it less desirable to people less desirable to go get more information. You should be able to settle the issue, right? I'm going to do. Okay, in the back, please.
So you're talking about the building of trust. My question, I guess, is about the decay of trust. I mean, we've, not in science in particular, but in a lot of other fields, so-called experts, they didn't see the possible slowing. They didn't see the 2008 financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So these experts who are failing in all these other fields, so doesn't that sort of carry over? So what makes this expert an expert when all these other experts are not able to do their jobs?
Right. I guess the answer is that members of the public still want expert advice, and they're trying their best to find the reliable experts. And when they think the mainstream experts, the economists and the biomedical researchers are not good experts, they're going to unconventional expert sources. That's why I said that expertise is proliferating. It's just a different calibration of expertise, and that's why we're struggling to figure out what to do from there. So I think we actually agree with each other on that expertise is fraught right now. Yes?
Just to follow up on that, don't you think that the scientific community and the community of experts are actually doing themselves a disservice. So, for example, the financial crisis, that was predictable.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody made some money off
Yeah.
of it, so, right? I mean, we know that.
Mm-hmm.
A classic example as well is I'll take the Canada Food Guide. You know, the focus on fat,
Right.
when in fact sugar should have been the focus.
Yeah.
So what are your suggestions about dealing with that stuff?
I mean, for the fats versus sugars issue, that was a corruption created by industry influence. So the answer to that is regulate industry influence on scientific research.
I mean, that's where people's trust disappears.
Right. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, I mean, and when those stories get reported, people are incensed, and at the same time they're not surprised either, because we see so many examples of this. So this is a good time to do that. Part of that sort of self-reflection on scientific institutions is to rethink those kind of relationships. This is a good time, when you've got vaccine hesitancy and this kind of low public trust. This is the time when you should be enacting bold changes. Take you, please. Yes. Mm-hmm.
How much of an effect do you think religious views have on this sort of thing? Like people think the earth is flat, the Bible says so.
Yeah.
Climate change, God's going to save us all.
Right.
God's going to heal my child, or save my child, or protect my child. And competing trust too.
Right.
Do I trust my preacher, or do I trust the scientists? I mean, it's certainly part of this sort of social environment that we're making these decisions. I can tell you that the number of religious objections to vaccines has always been fairly low. Also, when religious scholars have tried to trace back what are the religions that are actually anti-vaccine, and it's actually zero. There are maybe Christians and maybe faith healers, so it's used as a way to sort of push back against certainly some kind of sort of modernist thinking about science and about life, and sort of a yearning for conservatism. But I'm not, at least in vaccines, because it's actually a fairly low number of people that are doing religious exemptions, it hasn't actually presented as a huge problem. But I don't have a good answer for what about religion. It's just it's part of it. Right. Yeah. And of course, it's legally difficult to sort of impose on what's seen as religious freedom. My guess is that religious freedom about not vaccinating your children is eventually going to get challenged in court. I don't know that it's going to hold up as well, because it doesn't seem to be grounded in doctrine. It may not last much longer, but it's going to get a lot of people upset. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think we're walking into a very big problem with vaping. Where were the medical authorities on this? How did we end up suddenly in this very serious problem? We couldn't rush fast enough to approve vaping. Where were the authorities on this thing?
Our regulatory system is not as robust as it could be. That is the answer. Yeah.
We didn't have the science yet.
We didn't have the science yet either, and there's I think that the tendency for thinking about new products is until we have evidence that it isn't safe, it's going to be pushed forward. And
so if we didn't have the science, how could you say yes, it's a good idea? So my concern is a lot of people are going to suffer with this, and I think the health authorities have done themselves a disservice. It's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah, it definitely lowers public trust in our regulatory system. So I agree with you on that. Okay, I'll take one in the front here, and then I'll move back here.
You gave, I think it was the example, maybe, I don't know if it was directly with vaccines or just more generally, go on Health Canada, have a look, and I guess maybe the idea there is some impartiality or some consensus or things like that to make it a more reliable source.
Right.
But when people are concerned about industry capture, industry corruption, and these foreign parts of their reasons why they don't have trust, where do you say that people can turn to develop a reliable sense of when science has been captured by industry, as opposed to when it hasn't been, when even something like Health Canada that you're referring us to dropped the ball as badly as they did in an instance, and we can actually say that things get passed, we can go and purchase them.
Right.
There's no science done behind it, and there might be this presumption on the part of the public that there's some science. So I guess what I'm asking you is where do you say we can go to try and understand whether or not we can trust the science on something so we don't?
You're
all those people that don't do that.
right. I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer because there is no, great website for, analyzing who's corrupt and who didn't. We usually find it out after the fact, and I think this actually explains a lot of the mistrust. So even though vaccines look really good, I chose to vaccinate my children based on my feeling that the long-term evidence of vaccinating was far more compelling than the evidence for not vaccinating them. But we find out that there's been industry capture only after the class action lawsuits happen, or people do these kind of deep dive investigative investigative research into like medical devices or how opioids were marketed, and it's always too late because we react to situations rather than getting in front of it and regulate it. So unfortunately, we do the best we can. We look at things like what's the history of, let's say, this pharmaceutical company, what's the long-term knowledge about vaccines. I think at this point it would be really hard to say that there must be some cover-up that hasn't been exposed yet just because they've been around, at least the older vaccines have been around for a long time. That's the best we've got, though. And so because of that, I find myself sympathetic to parents who think the same way that I do, but end up on the other side and say, I just don't have enough to go on to trust vaccines. I'm like, yeah, I wish you had more. I wish you had more to trust vaccines. Yes.
What's your take on the superbug? It's back again. And we don't have vaccinations.
Yeah.
It goes up about every 5 years.
Yes.
So hopefully we won't be behind the 8 ball on that one.
Right. I don't know what to say about superbugs. I will say that it's another reason it's actually a good reason to vaccinate your kids so they don't end up in hospital where they might catch a superbug. Yeah. Yes. Right here. Yes.
I think one of the issues with the talk here, you're talking about expertise, that's expertise. We were talking about fake experts and that. What makes an expert? Dan is a respiratory therapist.
Right.
Neonatal respiratory therapist. He was teaching a bunch of doctors today, neonatologists, how to ventilate kids, because he's probably an expert on that.
Yeah.
Some neonatologists, they might be an expert on, hearing development in 23-week-old babies or something like that. But who's an expert? How do you define that?
Well, experts are those who have a high level of knowledge about the issue at hand. So people who have studied this subject, it can be pretty specific. You're right. It'll be the people who have studied it, who have practiced it, who have lived it. Though that's how expertise is created.
We've got a bunch of philosophers over here.
Yeah.
And they're all PhDs in that.
Right.
They all probably disagree on a lot of things.
Yeah.
What makes you an expert in philosophy? You can pick the most important.
Yeah.
You can pick the most Poland sort of a dense paragraph or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I'm going to rate the philosophers later. What makes you an expert in philosophy? We have sort of regulations around these things. The same way an MD needs to have a license, philosophers need to have a PhD, and then prove that they've got the stuff with their publication record, things like that.
Also, we're experts on our own area of expertise.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's quite obvious that you know what you're talking about when you're talking about.
Thank you.
But so we're not experts on everything.
Right. Right. Yeah. Just because you're an expert on something doesn't mean you're an expert on everything. Yes.
When I went to school in the 70s, I was taught two things. First of all, the profession, and secondly, how to think. Now, after several decades working in the teaching hospitals and dealing with college and university students for so many years, I have the sense now that students are no longer taught how to think.
Right.
They're taught what I would call a secular gospel. In a sense, they're being taught to not think when they graduate. Do you share my concern?
I guess it depends where the students are coming from. I think philosophy students are taught how to think. That's what we do. It could be that the training that medical technologists. It has been said about medical training that it's too much back of the book answers and not enough thinking on your feet. There's been many suggestions about how to recalibrate medical education to deal with that, including things like introducing medical humanities into the curriculum. Unfortunately, the curriculum is so packed that it's hard to find space for the kind of critical thinking, decision making under uncertainty. There's things that could be done that are hard to do. Right. Yes.
I'm American, and I just came back from a trip to D.C. From Washington, and in the U.S., we have this role model of the science doubter in chief.
Yeah.
Donald Trump and his view on climate change and climate science. And I'm wondering if you have a take on that as a sort of a role model for doubting experts. Because I find it hard to imagine that he mistrusts, that he's looking for who to trust, you know what I mean? But maybe he's not a good model for the public in general.
Right.
Maybe he doesn't represent the normal, everyday public person, and he has a different problem with science than the everyday member of the public, you know what I mean? He's certainly a bad role model, I'm not doubting that.
Yeah, Donald Trump seems to be, well, he's epistemic populism. That he's a good example of that, and he is using his accounts of science and expertise to further his own goals. He's not. I don't think there's any search towards knowledge and truth in the work that he does. He's a showman.
Do you think that is the role model for doubting science
I think he's riding that wave. I don't think he's the role model, but now we've got a science doubter in the White House. That's what's different. But there are many like that. Yes. New people. Yes.
Do you know of any cases where a scientific institution has gone more than just outreach to the public in general, but actually targeted individuals who are known for their doubting? If the anti-vax people would actually invite Jenny McCarthy to actually come and see how it's all done and actually learn it all. Has anybody tried that?
No, I've never heard of anything like that. I was involved last year in a sort of like a democratic deliberation over vaccines, and we had a lot of people involved with this project, including someone from Public Health Ontario, and she was the most concerned from any of us about allowing misinformation to be discussed in this group context. This was a deliberation. Imagine like a town hall meeting where people get to talk about their views about vaccines, and there was no sort of vetting of, you can say what you want, including you might actually share misinformation. And of course, there was the risk that people that come in there very confident about vaccines might leave less confident. And we had someone from public health who was very concerned about the public impact of that. So that said to me, this is just one person, of course, but this is first of all one person who was first willing to sign on to the project as a co-investigator, and then the one that was most worried about it. And they, I think the public health and many sort of scientific officials working in this domain are very worried about letting, let's say, letting an anti-vaxxer speak, like Jenny McCarthy, and that might convince people, and it might make people less likely to vaccinate. And it's debated. It's even people have tried to study this, whether if we just let people talk about it, will it in the end result in more misinformation, or will it be some kind of corrective? And there's I've seen studies saying both. Like if you allow the airing of dissent, I guess is what I'd say. If you allow the airing of dissent, is that going to make people more skeptical or not? And people that have tried to quantify this say yes and no. So I don't know where it's going to land. Yes. Hello. You got a question?
So there's a lot of trust talks. How do you know who to trust?
Well, that's the thing. How do you know who to trust? You usually look at that person and try to, first of all, you sometimes get a feeling about, is this person, does he seem honest? Are they nice? Are they going to think about what I need when they give me advice about kinds of things? So sometimes it's a little bit of a feeling. You can also ask other people what they know about this person. If you're looking at someone who's famous, you might be able to check them out on the internet, and that's how you know if you can trust a person. Yeah. Yes.
So, building off that maybe a little bit, I'm fairly new to following a lot of scientists and stuff on Twitter. Reading a lot of popular science books. I find that a lot of scientists are extraordinarily bad communicators. They shouldn't probably interface with the public. By interfacing with the public, they actually they have people push back on it, right?
Yeah.
If I feel stupid when you talk to me, you know,
right.
guys, get out of my face, right? And I think there's a lot of that happens.
Yeah.
Is it, I mean, not knowing how these folks get educated, is there just a big gap in educating scientists how to communicate and talk?
Well, now it's become pretty standard in universities that they now offer courses on science communication. It's this idea that we are at a time where scientists can't just spend all their time in the lab. They need to get out there and communicate with the public. And of course, that is difficult to do. That some people don't do it well. And especially, you know, I think scientists need training around that, especially if they're talking about highly contentious areas of research like climate science and things like that. But there is a push to get scientists out there. Whether if they're not doing it well, it's because they're not being educated to do it. But what I've been hearing is most scientists are still reluctant to do that. They say, look, I didn't go into science because I like to talk to people. I do science because I like science, right? They would like to stay in the lab, but now they're feeling this pressure to get out there and do outreach. And the ones that do it well should be rewarded for doing that. They should be part of their sort of tenure and promotion model. I don't know if they're there about that, but there's this big push for scientists to do that. Hopefully they'll learn to do it well. Yes.
This has been a great talk.
Thanks.
I've personally read the article by the IPCC that says, you know, the consensus on the consensus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been so tempting not to like hand fist that on deniers all
Yeah.
over this, but instead it's like, it's not really always going to be the best way to get through to people who already have their mind made up. And unfortunately, some of the ways that they have their mind made up is not fully conspiracy theories, but again, like the propagation of deliberate misinformation that's made to look legitimate.
Right.
Is there an active, I guess almost like a deep web combat going on to like, how do we get at the source of some like the really bad propagators of the misinformation in the first place?
I don't know, because some of it is you know, entrenched in the deep web. It's hard to get to it. I mean, right now all we've got is the technical solution of Facebook trying to flag its questionable sources. Pinterest just said we're not going to post anything about, let's say, vaccines or things like that. So, you know, it's a pretty surface level correction, but that's what we've got right now. I will take you, please.
Yes. Going back to the people who actually produce this information, most practicing scientists would not recognize this at all. It's not whether they can be trusted as individuals, especially not based on feeling or intuition.
Yeah.
They're not after being trusted themselves, but they want their results to be trusted.
Okay.
And there are very standard criteria for that. The criteria of testability, of reliability, or if you prefer, of falsifiability. And this is something that has nothing to do with the way in which most of the public would judge the results of science.
Right.
It also depends very much on the kind of universe you're sampling. If we go to Alabama or Tennessee, more than 50% of the population there would believe that there's no such thing as evolution. People would be very willing to accept hybrid seeds produced by artificial selection, by people who believe in evolution, or people who practice evolutionary principles, but they use the results and they don't believe the principles.
I see.
So
okay.
I think this is to me, as a former scientist, this is completely unrecognizable.
Okay.
This is not the way that scientists would look at their science
Right.
at all.
Okay. So
what are the conclusions? I mean, this is, should we trust what you're saying to us?
Yes?
It's in our practice, it's like looking at a foreign tribe and judging the habits of a tribe by their haircut.
Right.
Something completely different.
I think you need to keep in mind that these kind of controversies that I'm speaking of are things that are happening in the public realm. They're not happening within scientific communities where we've got consensus on consensus on consensus. This is how the publics take up science. So they are not usually not reading the papers. If they are, they may not be in a good position to judge it. So we gain most of our the publics gain most of our scientific knowledge through intermediaries, through books and blogs, and through through newspaper articles. So we are not looking at it in the same way that you are, because that kind of criteria is not necessarily accessible to us in sort of popular literature. So I'm interested in how science and the publics interact, not what's happening in the scientific communities, where you're exactly right. We have these standards for what is good science and what isn't within scientific institutions, but without it's different.
Which public?
Yeah.
Are we talking about the public in an educated Western European country, or are we talking about the public in deeper Texas?
Well, we apparently are talking about both of those publics, because when they try to track who is not vaccinating their children, who doesn't believe in climate change, it is not the case that uneducated people don't believe the science and educated people do. It's actually got the polarization is on divides differently than educated, uneducated. It tends to be based on ideological views, conservative versus progressive on climate change. Vaccines actually goes sort of subdivides. Progressives can be pro-vaccines or anti-vaccine, but it's for ideological reasons, not because they understand or don't understand science. That's been well documented. It's different out there. Yeah. Yes.
So, well,
Oops.
we're out of time. Sorry. Maybe you can ask your question after.
Yeah, I'd be.
I wanted to ask this gentleman.
Okay, but first let's thank our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much.